hello everyone, and all the people who are joining us today as well. We're going to have today a very interesting talk with Anneroos Planqué-van Hardeveld and Marijn Hoijtink about the rising use of machine learning platforms within the military domain and the use of AI as well in the military. I'll be today your host, Ljubiša Metikoš. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at the Institute for Information Law and also the Legal Philosophy Department of the University of Amsterdam. My focus is on AI regulation, and the influence of AI on legal discourse, on public accountability and government institutions. Maybe it's nice for Anneroos and Marijn if you could also introduce yourself to the other attendees.
Sure, Anneroos, you start.
Great, thanks. So my name is Anneroos and I'm a PhD candidate at the Political Science Department at the University of Amsterdam. And Marijn is my co-supervisor, and I work on Google Big Tech as emerging security actors. So that's what I do mostly, and I also teach at PPLE, which is a program also here at UvA.
So you'll be teaching our future queen as well.
I might. I hope so. Yeah.
Explain a little bit about data politics and my name is Marijn Hoijtink. I am an assistant professor in international relations at Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, where I teach mostly on international security and international relations, global political economy. My current research is funded through the Dutch Research Council and examines really the rise of the sort of broad category of AI within warfare, look at sort of experimental practices of experimental projects and practices of military AI. So that's also partly what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, very interesting, very fascinating. We're delighted to have you here. For the format of this little interview, this event, this Humane Conversation, we'll have first you discussing your article together, The Rise of ML Platforms in Military Tech, for about 10 to 15 minutes. And then afterwards, I'll be asking some questions. And at the end, other people, panelists, attendees, the public can also join in and ask a few questions as well. And that's about the format that we have. So let's get started with your presentation. I don't know if you have any slides or
no
or just that's
so just an actual conversation. But yeah, it's still COVID-proof, so we'll be mostly seeing each other, I guess, or ourselves in that conversation. Thanks so much also to you, Ljubiša and Irina, for organizing and for inviting us to talk about our research. We're inviting us on these Humane AI conversations. Very happy to talk about it currently, I think partly because we just published an article together and also one that was single authored by me on these kinds of issues. One indeed, what we'll be talking about today more specifically is on the role of machine learning platforms in warfare and the role of big tech and Google specifically in sort of providing its machine learning platform TensorFlow in the context of warfare and Project Maven specifically. We'll talk about that later. Another paper by me is more on what I call the experimental way of warfare, which is really about how Western militaries particularly, but I think we can expand this also given the current context, are experimenting with new digital practices, technologies, and projects in the context of warfare. And so I think we wanted to start the conversation today by really also zooming into some of the current circumstances and the current context, with obviously the war in Ukraine as a very important event going on and making a lot of these developments visible or not so visible. We can talk about that as well. But I think what we're seeing particularly in the current context is that once again, the role of big tech is very important and is becoming increasingly visible within geopolitics and the context of war. And I think within academic writing, but also within public discussions, the focus has been mostly on the role of big tech in or the role that they have or should have in moderating content, right, when it comes to Russian trolls or Russian disinformation projects. We've seen a lot of this in relation to Twitter, for instance, where it's supposed to sort of really do more in terms of moderating content on Twitter. We've seen this also in relation to Microsoft. There was some news about Microsoft really alerting the Ukrainian government a few days before the Russian intervention or the Russian military aggression as to how Russia was planning a cyber attack in Ukraine. Microsoft has also liaised with the EU and with NATO in that respect. So we see a lot of these types of examples in the news and also in academic writing, where the big platforms are usually discussed in relation to this kind of new space of information warfare, right? So they're often discussed in relation to the emergence of information warfare as a new space or a new sort of battlefield that is very much separate from conventional fighting, conventional war fighting. And I think what our research is about more is that we look into how big tech becomes very much implicated in conventional war fighting and becomes sort of part of today's battlefields, right? How it's actually becoming an actor within the actual battlefield and really becoming sort of an actor in war fighting. And so we've seen some of these examples over the years. So one important, I think, event for many of us was the controversy surrounding Project Maven. So for those who are not aware of this project, I think it was in 2018 that Google employees found out that they were actually, or the company was actually part of a project that was initiated by the US Department of Defense, and that was supposed to be about automating US drone footage with the idea that so-called objects of interest could be automated, and therefore that potential suspects or cars, people on the ground could be flagged by the algorithms developed by Project Maven. This was a very important event for scholars, but also activists within the context of the whole discussion around lethal autonomous weapon systems, because many said this is sort of a starting point for the development of these types of weapons that can eventually then attack people on the ground without much human intervention. But aside from Project Maven, we've seen some other examples. We've seen this big sort of debate or discussion going on between the big tech companies and their fight basically over the contract for the US Joint Enterprise Defense Initiative, or JEDI, the cloud project that the US Department of Defense was initially interested in developing. And most recently, in the context of Ukraine, we're seeing that as some companies are also becoming involved, talking to the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, offering their services. I think you may, on the website of Humane AI, there's a reference to Clearview AI, a US-based company that is offering facial recognition technology to the Ukrainian government. And most recently, we've seen reports of the CEO of Palantir going to the Ukraine, talking to the Ukrainian government, to Zelensky, about the possibilities of Palantir offering their services in the context of war in this fact, or on the actual battlefield. It was in fact the first Western CEO to actually visit the Ukrainian government in Kiev. So I think that speaks millions. And so what these examples for us sort of underline is how big tech and some of these startup companies that develop information and communication technologies are increasingly involved in building the underlying data infrastructure that is being deployed in warfare, and increasingly also on the actual battlefield. And so our research is interested in sort of zooming in on this bigger, increasingly bigger infrastructural role that the big tech are taking on. and therefore also in the increasingly important role or their implication actually in the conduct of how we can call algorithmic or increasingly automated warfare, and the type of violence that is part of that. So that's sort of a short introduction of what we're going for in our research. Anneroos will zoom in on the actual argument that we're making in this recent article that was published in International Political Sociology, and that really zooms in on the role of Google within Project Maven, and also beyond that when it comes to providing machine learning expertise and the actual infrastructure platforms to do that.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Marijn. Yeah, I'll try to zoom in a little bit on what we've done. Pardon me to look at my notes, but so what we did indeed is have a look at Project Maven as this key case in how the US military at least is sort of trying to use AI platforms or machine learning platforms in its practices. And we were just wondering, how does that work? What does that do? And as a starting point, we thought it would be good to have a look at what TensorFlow is, because TensorFlow is actually the machine learning platform built by Google that was used in Project Maven. So it sort of ties all our interests together. And we really want to understand a little bit what those platforms look like, what they do, what they allow for, etc., to get a grip on this complex topic, especially as non-techie people. So we argue that we see this platformization of the military and these type of platforms such as TensorFlow sort of allow that to happen. So what is TensorFlow then, for those who don't know? I mean, it's I guess very known to some, but very unknown to many. So TensorFlow is one of the world's most used open source machine learning platforms. And what that means is that it is a programmable modular ecosystem of tools, libraries, and community resources that mobilize pre-existing machine learning expertise and provides the necessary infrastructure to code and deploy machine learning models. So for those who are unfamiliar with it, machine learning requires a lot of time and resources and expertise. And basically what Google is doing with TensorFlow by making that open source is giving that to the machine learning community and sort of bringing them in there, but also relying on them to build and improve new machine learning, basically. And it allows you to build these models, which actually requires, as I already said, quite a lot of resources and expertise and also computing power. And this model allows you to make use of what has already been done by others and then use that for your own purposes. So that is also how TensorFlow was used by the military, or at least that's what we assume, that they use this platform to then build and choose and use what has already been made by the community to help them platformize or help them create these machine learning systems. So it has a lot of pre-labeled data sets, a lot of pre-trained layers and models that you can make and then also scale to other parts. So you can, on the one hand, this platform allows the military to sort of centralize all the data that it has and to make sense of that through building a machine learning model. So it sort of centralizes a lot of efforts, and that is also what they wanted with Project Maven, to sort of lead the way and create this infrastructure for the military to bring lots of sources of data sources together to improve their decision making. But at the same time, it also allows for decentralization, because a platform such as TensorFlow actually allows for a lot of scaling. So you can also use it on your phone. So soldiers in the field could then also use whatever model was built on their in their context. So it sort of centralizes, but also decentralizes sort of the use of machine learning for the military. And what we criticize is that while TensorFlow simplifies and optimizes a lot of machine learning creation, for lack of a better term right now, it also steers it. It is open source, which lots of people would think is great. But that doesn't mean that there is no control by Google on what happens on that platform. Just to name the main thing that we point out in our paper is that it is a deep learning machine learning platform. So the type of machine learning that you can make and that you can sort of fit together modularly on that platform is all deep learning, which is a very specific type of machine learning that has a lot of critique attached to it. But that is the sort of direction that TensorFlow takes. And if you use it, then you therefore also take that approach with you, because it allows for that type of, well, it gives the infrastructure for that type of innovation. So that is one of the things we critique, and we see that Google actually has quite a bit of control, especially when it comes to its main code base that sort of determines the overall structure of what the platform looks like and how it works. There's quite a bit of control, even though it is open source and therefore open and free to use by those who want it. Let's see what else I mentioned. So we mentioned this centralization and decentralization of these machine learning practices that this platform allows for. But then, of course, what people want to know is why is this relevant, right? What is politically at stake here? And so on the one hand, we sort of bring forward this, as I said, this centralization and decentralization of algorithmic practices in the military, which has its issues and its problems. It makes it way more usable to the military, and it's also then it is actually used on the battlefield. And on the other hand, we bring forward this sort of dependency sort of on big tech here, that Google created this platform that was used in Maven and then was seen as an example by the military on how to use machine learning. But then the Google is making a lot of profit by doing so, even though it is using this open source platform that lots of people add to. So what we also try to show is that Google is profiting from this, but it is also building and relying on what the open source community is adding to its platform. So it can make use of that.
Yeah, so did we. Yeah.
We're unfortunately in a room that we booked, but so apologies for the interruption. I'll try to finish my thoughts in the middle. Oh, they were in the wrong room. Yeah. Sorry for this is what happens when you want to record something in these times on a university. But yeah, so we try to bring out how the open source community, which can be anyone who wants to do something with machine learning, right? How they help boost and push the machine learning models and layers that are created on TensorFlow, but those models and layers can then also be used by the military. So that group of people, without knowing, probably is then also being made use of, and especially that becomes problematic if the expertise that they deliver is then used for violence by military purposes, right? So that is, I think, hopefully in a nutshell, what we wanted to mention. I probably forgot to mention a few things, but no doubt we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I was very surprised and intrigued by how you use a term which is normally used within media studies and platform regulation to denote social media platforms, and use it to show this whole new side of these big tech companies and this whole new area in which they're getting involved. It's very fascinating. I think also that you touch upon a very good insight into how we should look at these practices, because quite often when we look at algorithmic regulation and academic literature on that, it's quite often focused on the end products, the algorithm not functioning well, the algorithm discriminating, etc., and completely ignoring the huge community of people involved in the creation of that. And something I was also very fascinated by is that quite often when we look at, for example, platforms regulation, we see algorithms discriminating people, content moderation algorithms discriminating people, quite often because the technologies that it's based on, the machine learning model, the data collected, the data labels that are used, quite often contain certain prejudices, quite often unconsciously implemented. So, for example, something I found very interesting in this case for your military perspective was the case of a Google program labeling pictures. And it was one picture of a black hand holding a water hose, which was labeled with the word gun. They photoshopped the hand to be white, and then when it made it the white hand, it said water hose. So within this context, I'm thinking about a military weapon or a system or facial recognition software looking at people, denoting, for example, wrongly that certain minorities are criminals or dangerous, which can have, of course, lethal effects. So my question to you is do you see any ways, or do you see any practices, current practices already, in which certain normative presumptions, normative choices are seeping into military tech because of the huge unconscious prejudice being instilled in these systems through open source coding programs?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. It's definitely a question that a lot of people within our academic community are also talking about or discussing and researching, maybe even aside from the whole discussion about, again, lethal autonomous weapon systems, which is, of course, has become sort of very public discussion and public debate about sort of the future, those future Terminator-like sort of weapons that might in the future then be fully autonomously operating and making decisions about life and death. But I think already in sort of current military practices, we see a lot of what you're describing, and we can I think already critique it on the basis of that. So there's a lot of very rich literature in relation to drone warfare and drone attacks that has explained and has described how drone warfare and targeting by drones is a highly racialized and highly gendered practice. Partly this research is based on a recording that was a few years ago sort of published by, I think, a newspaper in the US that sort of described the conversation between the drone operators just before an actual attack. And I think on the basis of that transcription, you can see that a lot of the discussions about the targets, about targeting, about who comprises a target in this kind of context and what is a legitimate target is a question that is partly decided on by algorithms in this decision-making process when it comes to targeting. But it's also partly based on, again, very racialized and gendered assumption about who represents a target and who represents a legitimate or justified target. So yeah, again, the work of Lucy Suchman, for instance, or Lauren Wilcox discusses precisely this problem, and also warns that if we see sort of a further automation of those decision-making practices in the context of targeting specifically, but we can move beyond that, and we can also look at some other instances of algorithmic decision-making in warfare, where it's about, for instance, sentiment analysis, or indeed sort of not so much facial recognition for targeting purposes, but maybe for deciding who should be held hostage, etc., something that we see apparently happening within the context of Ukraine, then we should be raising those questions and should critique indeed those practices on the basis of precisely these problems and this critique. And yeah, here I think we're following the direction of a lot of the work done in the fields of law enforcement, a lot of people within sociology and criminology that have already critiqued also the use of the same systems basically within the context of policing that are now being transferred with all their issues and all their problems into the space of war.
Yeah, a very interesting point of view, and also very interesting that so many fields so many different fields are coming together and are being useful to one another. For example, social media, but also criminology and sociology, law enforcement. I think we can learn a lot from each other because many of these issues are not just to one, specifically one context. And my second question to you was, we now established that there is quite a big normative impact being created by the community, the open source community. Then the question is, are we able to actively reconstruct what those normative choices are? Are we able to review that, have proper human oversight? Can we try to remove bias effectively? And is the military able to still hold control over such military technology when they're giving so much out of hands to big tech corporations and to massive amounts of programmers? Is it possible for a soldier coder to really, truly well review a specific program?
It's also a very good question. Maybe
It's
you
a
want
lot of
to start
questions.
first, and then maybe you want to start first. I can zoom out.
A lot to unpack.
Yeah, I mean, so what you hear a lot here, especially with TensorFlow, that it is open source, and usually open source is seen as safer and maybe less biased as well, because so many people work on it, so many eyes are on the code. You can see the code, you can have a look at the libraries on which these models are built and how the layers are built, which type of data sets are used, right? You can have a look. It's very complicated, so I wouldn't call it very accessible necessarily, but you could, right? You could have a look if you want to on what it's based. But automation bias is a big thing. If you have a system that has a good predictability rate, that gives you these outcomes of whatever it is you ask that model, whatever it can do, right? There's automation bias is a big one, whereas we tend to trust computers, right? And we tend to trust those systems. But of course, you mentioned we know that many of those are actually rather biased. If someone could then take that into consideration or change it in the fields, that I would doubt, but I mean, now I'm just speaking from my own gut feeling, right? But that is because there's so much bias inherent into machine learning models in the first place. There's bias in the data, right? And there's lots of bias in those data sets and what they measure and how they're made and what they're supposed to do. But then there's also choices in how you configure your machine learning model, like which layers, how, when, etc. Like all of those are already decisions, and every decision, I would say, has some sort of bias in there because you're making a decision to look at something and not at something else. And then there's bias in then how you interpret what comes out. So maybe on the field you could interpret, sort of compare what whatever the program is telling you to your knowledge of what is going on around you. Perhaps there's room there, but to take out that bias is very difficult. And what we hear a lot is that we need more data, right? That is the solution, is always more data. Because more data means you exclude less people or less, like, you include as much as you can. But that is rarely the answer to that problem. So there's bias on all these different levels, so that makes it very complicated.
And maybe zooming out, so one of the so what I think Anneroos is also referring to is that the solution that's presented is often a technical one that says we need more data, which of course leads to new problems, which is mostly in relation to conflicts and warfare, and also policing, law enforcement is a question of surveillance, and sort of problem of ongoing surveillance in these sensitive contexts. But zooming out a bit further still, I think it's a really good question, right? The extent to which it's a question about, I guess, accountability, responsibility that you're raising here, which is a question about to what extent can we still hold someone to account in this context where the decision to kill someone on the battlefield in a certain context is being sort of dispersed, right, across what has now become also very popular in talking about this in the context of international regulation, is across this human-machine interaction, right? Where both the human and the machine become implicated in making decisions about life and death, which is not really new, of course, but the sort of increasing automation raises this problem. And there, I think, those who've been studying international humanitarian law many have said we have principles, or we have particular ways to hold still the state to account or individuals to account when something goes wrong. But there's also many who say there is an accountability gap, and it's widening because of the way in which these systems are being built, the fact that they are increasingly intransparent, difficult to access, and very intransparent because of deep learning techniques, for instance, and therefore it becomes increasingly difficult to sort of understand why a certain decision has been made, under which circumstances, in what kind of context. So we're working here with the sort of black boxed decision. And so, yeah, I think those sort of existing frameworks of accountability are very much challenged by these technologies, and increasingly so. I mean, there's also many of our colleagues who would say that there is already an accountability gap, as we've, for instance, seen in the context of Hawija, the attacks in Hawija that were eventually then conducted by a Dutch air fighter, and about which we came to know very little. And when we started to know about it, it was because of journalists and because of investigative journalists. And there's still a long process of finding out what happens and whether this was in accordance with international law. So. These kinds of, I think, incidents or events become more likely in the future under these circumstances and with these developments related to the broader fields of military AI.
Yeah, you touch upon a very huge issue within the rising use of AI, namely the dispersal of responsibility, the dispersal of thinking, reasoning about why you're doing certain things. The intellectual task of taking a decision is deconstructed and placed in the hands of multiple people, which, what you said, creates a dispersal of accountability and responsibility. And what you said, Anneroos, was very interesting about human oversight and trying to fix this by having a human reviewer. But you touch upon some serious issues in that field, namely automation bias and the lack of ability of people to actually perform such review. Was this very interesting article on the use of AI in public administration and the judiciary by Ben Green, an empirical study in which he collected multiple empirical studies on the use of AI in those fields. And time again and again and again, it showed that people were not able to properly review automated decision-making processes, not just because of automation bias, that's one problem, but also the problem of under-trusting it. Relying too much on your own bias, thinking, oh, I'm a human, I know what's happening, I reject this decision. So it's both an issue of over and under trust. And also what you said about having human review in the field, that's a very good point. Because if you're in the middle of a battlefield and the AI says, do this, do you have the time or the mental capacity to reasonably deliberate all the options to clearly think? No, that's ridiculous.
The whole reason why the military is experimenting with these systems is exactly to avoid that sort of contemplation, right? So the whole discourse is about acceleration, is about increasing speed, is about sort of going through the decision-making loop that the military talks about quicker than the adversary, right? So it's really about sort of speeding up and accelerating this decision-making process. And therefore it is definitely not about sort of thinking about that decision or questioning that decision. At the same time, that's really interesting. The study that you mentioned, there is also many within the military who are indeed trusting the system, right? Who are being trained in a very hierarchical system that really, I think also prioritizes human decision making to that extent. And there is also definitely a branch within the military that's very suspicious towards these new technologies and not very eager to take them up. And going even further, I think we see also very little knowledge when it comes to these types of technologies and systems within the military. And this creates a real problem, right, for military organizations. So it's also a really interesting development that's so far under studies, I think, is how military organizations are really trying to reorganize themselves and to become the sort of machine learning organization or big data organization, trying to hire other kinds of soldiers with a different kind of expertise. But that's not so easy. So I think what we're seeing is that a lot of those decisions and those developments are being outsourced to parties outside, as in this case, Google.
Yeah, and it also problematizes dialogue within these organizations on those normative questions, on who to target, who not to target. And it's funny that you say that on one hand, we have this tendency for AI to be implemented for efficiency reasons, to take away these decisions and disperse them around various actors. And funnily enough, within AI regulation, as a lawyer, I see that there's a huge push for the other side by implementing human oversight, having people, again, reason about what the decision is and what the decision entails and what its impacts are, whether it's accurate. But quite often what I see, and that's the pitfall that I see quite often in regulation, it's one person performing the review. It's one person thinking, okay, this is right or this is wrong. And that's just not a good way to assess an algorithm, as it's a huge project containing multiple people. You're not reasoning with an algorithm. You're reasoning with a team of hundreds of programmers, data labelers, a huge community, basically. And also, to take back to the point of automation bias, within the AI Act, there is this emphasis on automation bias of being an issue within human oversight. But currently, we still don't know how to deal with that, because the AI Act simply mentions the human reviewer needs to be aware of automation bias. And it's admirable that they try to solve this issue, but how do you see these regulation issues of human oversight, and how can we go beyond of just being aware of automation bias, in your opinion?
That's a
big question. It's a big question. I still haven't figured out of it.
I think it's very, when we're talking about again, sort of algorithmic or automated decision making on the battlefield, it's really something that's rarely discussed, right? So so we're still in the stage where it's about where basically the rationale is we have lots of data and we need something with it. We need to do something with it. And so basically our militaries are still sort of in the process of finding the right expertise to be able to do something with sort of this flood of data, which in the end then very often is not really a flood of data, because it's very often the data is already used, or it's not cleaned well enough for them to use it. But there's very much this sort of understanding that there's all this data, there's all this expertise out there in the civil world. There's all these good things that are being done with these kinds of systems developed by these startups or the big tech, and we also need to do something with it to have this, to sort of continue to lead this space of military AI. But I think, it might be different if talking to someone within the US military, although I think that even there, the situation is very similar as for instance, what's happening in the Dutch military is that there's very little expertise when it comes to how this should be done, who should do this, what are sort of the contexts in which we can do this. There's very little thinking about the data. So what kind of data, where do we store the data? How do we protect the data? What can we not do? There seems to be not a lot of discussion about that automation bias. Yes, we see that in relation to the bigger discussion about autonomous weapon systems. And there, I think the consensus is that there still needs to be some form of meaningful human control, right? That is the human should have some knowledge about how the system is working and should indeed be aware of the automation bias. But overall, I think there's the discussion about regulation is not so specific or not so specified yet.
Yeah, and that's very problematic because there was one sentence in your paper that really sprung out to me about a course for TensorFlow on what to do if the machine learning model does not know what to do. It says the model should know when to hand control over to human experts. And that's the shortness of that, the blasé nature of just saying hand over control. It perfectly illustrates what you're just saying, the huge lack of insight and discussion and deliberation about that this is a huge field, this human-machine interaction field that is very complicated and very tough to regulate. And also, I'm very happy that you also mentioned regulation, because within currently the field of law, there is a huge lack of regulation on military AI. We do have the AI Act, which is a great tool to regulate AI in both public and private sector, but it stipulates explicitly that it's not applicable to military AI.
Not touch military AI, yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge missed opportunity in my opinion as well, because we've been, I think also you've heard in the UN, there have been talks about having military recommendations and how military should deal with AI, but still it's very lackluster.
Yeah, and it's superficial, right? Because it's very difficult to make that distinction, I think, between military AI and what is non-military AI. In the context of Clearview AI, the company offering its services to the Ukrainian government, you see it, right? It's a tool that's developed for another space. And we would have to know more about how it's actually used and some of the problems that they encounter using it. And I don't think it's too easy to translate it into a different context, in this case, the actual battlefield. But again, it's sort of the companies are presenting it as something that's a possibility, and that's sort of a relatively easy possibility, right? You have the tool, it's been developed for something else, and we can transfer it also into the military space. And so there it's now being used to identify dead soldiers, right? Based on social media data provided also through Russian apps and websites. So I think it's also difficult to make a distinction between this is where the civil domain ends and this is where the military domain starts. And it's one of the things that we're also, I think, discussing in the paper by showing how, in this case, the open source community that's developing its models for a completely different purpose, for a completely different aim, becomes in a way implicated in these very sensitive and ethical discussions.
So the things that TensorFlow then is sort of uses, you probably won't see as very problematic. So for instance, because the model was built of multiple layers, right? Especially in deep learning, which has its own problems, but sometimes image recognition is sort of built with this enormous data set that is made, that is only articles of items of clothing and shoes. So there is this image base that allows this machine learning model to learn to recognize shapes and shadows, etc., and to identify items, but that then part of that is trained on this massive data set of articles of clothing articles, right? So that yeah, it doesn't seem very problematic, but what a platform like TensorFlow allows is that you can use all these different layers that have been trained on whatever and then combine them together, and then you could use it for a military purpose, but you could also use it for commercial purpose or something completely different. And just to come back to the human oversight, what is so problematic with, at least, or what we think is problematic, is that a lot of it is based on deep learning, which is inherently invisible. Like there are so many layers that are part of that model, and it learns through so many different nodes that even if you could look at the data, if you could look inside of it and you know which layers were in there, our human brain doesn't comprehend what the computer has learned, right? There is an outcome, and especially with unsupervised machine learning, especially, it's very difficult to trace back or to make sense of what the computer has actually learned in the way we understand knowledge and connection. So that makes it inherently invisible. So that makes human oversight great, but I mean, it's all based on deep learning. Then what can you really see then, right? That's sort of a structural problem.
Yeah, it's a very structural problem, and it's also that so many people are now being involved with this unclear black box military decision-making process and military tech used in conflicts that they didn't even know would happen when they started programming or photographing pieces of clothes or trying to get a shape into a TensorFlow. And something that I found very interesting was that within platform study, we also, of course, have the term network effects. And that's something you see explicitly coming up here, that people don't have any other option than to invest more in TensorFlow in order to get the best data set. You said in the beginning, this is one of the biggest, most prominent data sets and communities out there. So what is a programmer to do except be involved in military AI, basically? Do you see any way out for open source community to not be involved in this?
Or for the military, right? So there is a discussion going on within the military. So the US, I think, is building its own platform, so to say, its own so it's called it's escaping me, but there I'll find it. So it's building its own platform because it doesn't want to rely too much on big tech and be sort of sovereign when it comes to the data and what's being done with its data. But that invites a lot of criticism from people within the military who are saying there are these open source tools. Why are we not using them? We're using them on our personal computers, but if we're logging into the DoD, the Department of Defense computers, we're not allowed to use them, right? Often for security reasons or reasons of secrecy. So there's actually also a development within the military where some of the more tech developed soldiers are saying, look, we should not be using this baby software that the US DoD is offering us, but we should work with the stuff that everybody else has, which is TensorFlow, PyTorch. So that's from the other side. There is definitely also discussion about this, but when it comes to the open source community, that's a different story. I think one of the things we would be interested in is to see if that's something we should tease out talking to people, or understanding the extent to which that kind of knowledge is implicated in knowledge about warfare and targeting, for instance, and what can be done about that, whether that requires a new rebellion by Google employees or others. Yeah,
it's very interesting that you mentioned that there's this pitfall that both the military and the public is joining in together and don't have any way to escape because of how amazing this technology is. They both are being geared towards one another. One possible solution I had in mind that just sprang up to me is within data protection law, we have the right to data portability. you can have the right to get your private data and port and over to another one. And this is also being implemented more and more in social media, so that you can take all your conversations or pictures from Instagram and go to another platform. Perhaps it could also be a solution to this, I would almost say fake open source, because it's not truly open. It's still limited and controlled by big tech. Do you see it happening anytime soon, that we would break down the barriers that Google built and make it a truly open source community?
Well, I think parts of it are truly open source. I think it is up to the developer themselves to decide if they want to bring in what it is they built and if they want to contribute, right? So there's definitely ways for them to be like, we're taking this open source software, we're going to run it on our own machines, our own computer systems, and we're keeping it local, and we're building our own things, and we're not then contributing back to the repository, right? You can't do that, of course. So there are choices there that you can do that and to refuse. But I don't know, I haven't talked that much with people who are part of or who consider themselves part of that open source community and how they would feel about doing that or sort of retreating from open source. But I think you have lots of great people who try to make alternatives. It's just that, especially with, you mentioned more social media, is the problem that I personally notice is that it's very hard to get people on board with moving to an alternative, because alternatives are out there. But yeah, to move with everyone, that's the biggest problem, right? That is, it's hard to convince people. I find it difficult to convince people to go to a different type of platform.
And from the perspective of platform studies, there have been many different social media platforms that are being built for certain normative goals. So, for example, freedom of speech, or a lack of IP regulation, various other goals that they want. And quite often, almost every single one of them actually have failed again and again because of this issue. And I'm also very happy that you can take the data from the platform TensorFlow and create your, for example, non-violent, non-military, hippie open source community. But again, from the perspective of platform studies, is that feasible? Is that something that will succeed? Also, again, many interesting ways that these totally different fields, totally different applications can come together and have some really interesting exchange of insights.
And also, just to sort of nuance, I mean, it's not that we have seen that these specific parts that were brought in by the open source community are now actively used by the military, right? But that connection is there, because if they use TensorFlow and Project Maven, and Project Maven being this example case, it is very likely that they made use of expertise produced by the open source community. But I wonder if the open source community would recognize it as such, is that if they built this, if they added this nuance to this particular machine learning layer and they uploaded that to GitHub, it is very hard to trace if that is then actually used, right? So I wonder if they would find that. But again, then we need to do more research and talk to that community.
Empirical studies, surveys, seeing how people react. And maybe also how they would change their behavior if they would become more aware of their involvement. Very interesting stuff. Perhaps there's some people from the audience that want to ask some questions. Chris raise his hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I cannot show my face. I'm not allowed for some reason to turn on the camera. But thanks so much for the talk. I really learned a lot. What I was wondering, maybe you could share some thoughts on the opposite of using AI for military, but the maybe increasing danger of security risks that emanate from democratizing AI technologies. For example, these let's say, off-the-shelf algorithms make it increasingly easier to make deepfakes, and the risks that come from, let's say, extortion or cyberbullying or something like this. But also, I mean, looking into the future, we could see people using drones and equip them with off-the-shelf facial recognition algorithms for stalking or for even assassinations or something like this. So there is this great book by, I think it's, I forgot the author's name, but it's called Power to the People, and how technology is arming tomorrow's terrorists. And I was curious to get your thoughts on these kind of issues that AI technologies are increasingly available to everybody.
Yeah, I think that is what you just said about how it can arm future terrorists. That's part of the reason, I guess, also why it is seen as inevitable to use this type of technology, actually, is that because it is made sort of public and accessible, that therefore this also becomes inevitable to use it, right, to keep up with other actors. But yeah, you definitely, I would definitely put democratizing in between air quotes what that means, because that's very positive connotations, and to a certain extent it has definitely positive impact, but indeed, as you say, it can also be very tricky. And I noticed this a few years ago, that there was this this massive language processing model created, GTP2, I think it was back then, and I think there's a new one now.
Now 3, yeah.
Yeah, and it was by those who made the model, they said it was too dangerous to release, but then they ended up releasing it anyway, and that could power botnets, etc. Right? So yeah, there's definitely examples of how it is great that you could use it, but indeed, yeah, it does mean that those who mean harm can also use it.
I think it's a great question. It's very much on the minds of the great powers, so to say, right? Particularly now, I think we are seeing a move towards a proliferation of the use of drones, with also non-traditional drone countries providing most of the drones that are used in current fighting. Mostly, well, Turkey is building lots of drones that are being bought and used by countries worldwide. At the same time, I think, and this is why we'd probably need to know more about the actual, and this is very difficult research, of course, about the actual uses and actual practices of some of these things. What we know, and this is more anecdotal evidence that we are actually using in the paper, was that Project Maven was actually very difficult. Was somewhat of a failure, right? It was mostly actually a prototype that was important because it set sort of a lot of these developments in motion when it comes to integrating AI into the force. But it was a failure when it came to actually delivering algorithms or delivering models that were then being used in actual combat. Partly this was because the data was of very low quality. It was also because the data was not suitable, or the models were not suitable for using them in this context of combat or warfare, or in the Middle East, because this was the geographical location where it was being used. So there's a lot of mismatch there. So it's, in a sense, the story of Project Maven is also one of a lot of setbacks and failures that didn't really do much to slow down the US military in this case when it comes to investing in these systems. But it does also tell us that it's probably not, it's maybe not too easy to be building this, right, within this particular context. But again, with drones, we're seeing some developments in this space, so that's maybe just a future development. But it's definitely something that is on the minds of those who are developing this for military purpose.
Yeah, and maybe to follow up on that, and I'm glad, Anneroos, that you mentioned also the term of this positive connotation of democratization, and the same But I think still the same is the term is actually justified, just like decentralization. It's just that we have such positive connotations of these terms, but if we actually think through what they mean, if it means like giving, and the book is actually called Power to the People, which is also a very positive connotation. But I think in the war in Ukraine, we already saw that sometimes centralization is actually a good thing, and the monopoly on violence in the hands of democratic states is maybe might be a good thing, right? So often we have these maybe too positive thoughts when we think of democratization, decentralization, but in the end, the downside is that everybody could maybe use these algorithms for their own gains and then cause real danger to societal security. And I think this is really interesting work that you're doing from the other angle, from the military angle. But I think there's also the flip side of that. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and maybe to add one more thing is that this is one of the main arguments, or one of the main stakes in indeed sort of those international discussions about regulating military AI, and particularly automated weapons or autonomous weapon systems, right? Is that that's even a stake in the hands of or an argument that's raised by countries such as the US or the UK that are investing in these systems, and also the Netherlands, by the way, that we should invest in those things that are relatively positive, right, or good, or that can be used in a way that is ethically, whatever that means, ethically viable in this context. So a reason for everyone to at least continue to talk about regulation is that if we are developing these systems, it should be done in a way that reflects certain values and norms.
Mm-hmm.
Can I tag on that a little? Like, because we were mentioning that it, well, together with you, Chris, that everyone could theoretically use it, but something I do wanted to mention is that it is still not everyone who can use machine learning. It's still very, very difficult, even if you have TensorFlow. I've done the tutorials, and I can tell you, if you don't know, if you need to know coding, which I don't. So there are a lot of barriers still, even though it is available. You have GitHub, you have an amazing community, can probably help you out. You have people who create these guides. Google produces a lot of guides on how to do it, but it's still a particular set of knowledge that also is gendered often, and it is still very difficult to actually then do it. And it's a particular group of people who is probably it's easier for to get started with that. So that is also important, that it probably empowers those who already are somewhat comfortable with that type of work. Yeah, that is, I guess I want to say more, but I lost my thought.
That's a great point, but maybe to counter, I would argue maybe, well, this is a bit science fiction, but maybe you could say it requires a lot of technical expertise, because if you mentioned GPT-3, GPT-3 is actually also used to write code, right? That you type in GPT-3, please give me the Python code of the diagram which has this on the x-axis and this on the y-axis. So I would say using these algorithms will become more and more convenient for the average user. And I think for developing a deepfake, right now, you don't need any technical expertise anymore. You just require, I don't know, it's even getting more increasingly cheaper. So you don't need much to use that for your own purpose. But I would agree. Right now, it is still very difficult for the average user to use it, and some part of me hopes that it stays this way to prevent harm. But at the other side, like these open source communities is actually a good thing, that you take away a bit of the monopoly power that is in the hands of those who have the data and who have the code.
Yeah, right now it just there's even more dependency on than those who already have the expertise. And the issue with sometimes making it easier to make deepfakes, for instance, is that you, especially if you hardly have to know anything, then there's less room to critically interrogate what is going on if you don't need that knowledge even to make it, but you can just use whatever was created by others. I doubt that then those people are able to then critically interrogate what is happening. And because, for instance, with TensorFlow, Google produces a lot of like optimizers and fairness indicators and privacy indicators, and that you don't have to know anything about fairness or privacy, whatever. You can just put that in your model and then it's fine, right? So that is also a tricky part of that, I think, of making it easier for everyone to join. Yeah, it is probably not everyone has the expertise to actually know what they're doing.
There's so much that we've discussed in this meeting. It's a bit overwhelming, but I think your paper touched upon so many critical points for regulation, for lawmakers, for military people, for the open source community. And I really loved reading about it. I really loved learning about it. Also seeing how you connected all of them together in one paper.
Very dense. As your father-in-law also told us.
Yep.
It's very admirable. And I want to thank you for joining the Humane Conversation, taking time of your day to talk about this topic. Yes,